Good afternoon and welcome back from lunch. Our next session is presented by our friends at SEH. Take it away.
Good afternoon, everyone. We're excited to talk with you today and spend some time over the next hour talking about stakeholder engagement. And really our goal for today is to hopefully give you some ideas and tips and things that you might want to implement not only in your projects at your airports, but even in just how you go about things day to day at your airport outside of projects as well. So my name's Casey Nowicki. I'm an airport planner with SEH. I've been with SEH for about 14 years. I lead our airport planning group. So I do a lot of airport master planning and NEPA projects, and also quite a bit of stakeholder engagement for both planning and engineering projects.
My name is Melissa Underwood. I'm also a planner with SEH. I've been doing airport planning for about 20 years, 10 with SEH, and have my private pilot's license. And also work on airport layout plans, master plans, zoning type projects, and looking forward to our discussion today.
And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sean McMahon with SEH. I'm an airport engineer, a project manager. I lead our airport planning and design group, and I'm also a pilot. I learned how to fly in the Air Force, where I flew C-17 cargo planes. And just thank you for having us today to share our experiences with stakeholder engagement.
Great. Well, I want to just pause for a few moments here before we get into some examples that we want to talk with you about, and just talk about, some of the value and reasons why, stakeholder engagement is so important. One, as you think about projects and things that you might be doing on your airport, it really is more and more a critical component of infrastructure projects, whether it be at the planning level or environmental level, all the way through design and construction, and ultimately, the opening of hopefully an exciting project. It really is integral to reducing risk in your project and also controlling the message. And I think most importantly is just that it really does improve projects. It really will create better projects for you on your airport. You think of it from the lens of providing information that you might critically need in order to justify your project to the FAA. You can really get that from stakeholders. And it also helps to bring forward solutions that really can truly improve your project. And for me, that's the most exciting part, is going through stakeholder engagement and really seeing how projects kind of evolve and improve over time through that engagement process. You can better meet community needs. People really want transparent engagement, and they really want meaningful engagement and a role in the process. And as we've all experienced over the last year, engagement and how we live our day-to-day lives has definitely changed with the virtual environment. But I think it's brought forward a lot of really cool and unique tools that hopefully can be carried forward to create value beyond the pandemic as well. And also, really can drive equitable outcomes on projects. Making sure that all voices are heard and have a seat at the table and are able to participate in the conversation. So to start with, we actually want to be a little interactive here, and some of you may have used this before, but we're going to use a site called menteecom. So if you have a cell phone, or you could do this on your computer, and you just go to mentei.com. and you type in the code that's on the screen, 52165409, or if you have your cell phone, you can actually just hold it right up to the screen with your camera on the QR code, and you should get a link pop up to a website. So if you go to mentee.com and type that code in, you're going to see a survey question pop up. And these surveys is just an example of different ways that you can engage with stakeholders, whether it be a project or just interacting with users and tenants at your airport. So if you go to that website, there'll be a little poll. And the first question is just, who's here today? And I'll pop that up here. Oops. Give me a second. So you can kind of see the results. We had a couple people respond. But if you have a moment to kind of say, an airport consultant, agency, or FBO mechanic, or if you're a pilot, kind of what's the group of people that we have participating in the conversation today. Great, and we're going to revisit this a couple times throughout the presentation. So if you have it up in a browser window on your computer, I'd encourage you to keep it, or a spot on your phone. We'll come back to it a couple times. Oops. So, as we think about stakeholder engagement, we can really think of it as a spectrum. It's not a spectrum in that, one end is low quality and one end is high quality. There really is a role for all of these different ways that we can engage stakeholders throughout a project. It really just is that. It's a spectrum. It's not necessarily levels. And it's really, if we think of the spectrum of public engagement from informing all the way to empowering, it can really be used to help clarify what's the role of stakeholders on your project. And each level can be appropriate depending on the context of a project. So I think this is really interesting to think about as you think of, how have you been engaging with stakeholders at your airport historically, and how might you want to engage with them in the future? And I'll come back to this slide here in a second. And the other piece is really making sure that you're right-sizing engagement. You could have, a very large project that needs very robust stakeholder engagement throughout the entire project. And you may have a really small project that, it doesn't need, the same robust level of engagement. So it's really important to identify who your stakeholders are, assess what's their level of involvement that they want to have, that you want them to have, and then from there choose what the right method is for engaging with those stakeholders. You think of an airline is going to be wants to be engaged with differently than maybe your local EAA chapter at your airport. So it's really important that at the beginning of the project you pause and assess what the best method is. And going back to the kind of the spectrum of engagement, and you go through the different ways that you can engage with your stakeholders, I think it's really important to kind of understand what some of these examples are, as you're thinking of right-sizing your engagement. And you think, I think a lot of the more traditional forms of engagement more are on that informed spectrum on the far left there, where you have a project website, you're sharing information, open houses, you're pushing information at stakeholders. Just like the graphic shows. And when you're consulting, kind of the next level, you might be asking for public comment that you'd consider and adapt if needed. Maybe you have surveys. And then the next kind of middle level is more on the involve area of the spectrum. There might be a little bit more collaboration in this process, and then really moving fully into the collaboration realm, which I think for me is the most exciting place to be when you're really kind of starting to see yourself building a much better project. But you might be having workshops, focus groups, really creating a lot of interaction, listening sessions, and information is really flowing both ways throughout that process. And ultimately on the far end of the spectrum is really with the goal of empowering your stakeholders to provide, true meaningful influence and feedback into your project, where they're really involved in what the final decisions and plans are. And, as you think of a project, it's also not that a specific method is right for a project. You might have different methods for different stakeholders, and making sure that you're pausing to think about that at the very beginning of your project. One important piece, I think a lot of people, when you think of stakeholder engagement, you might be a little bit uncomfortable with it at the very beginning, just because, there might be a level of conflict. You're going to hear differing opinions, different people come at things with a different lens, and there really will be a diversity of opinions. I think the one important thing to remember is that it is that diversity of opinions that really can drive better projects and through that more meaningful engagement process. So, it really is important to be comfortable with a certain level of conflict. But in the end, it really does, kind of like this graphic shows, I always like to say, building a better light bulb throughout that process. So one of the first steps that we find really, really helpful in a project is to develop a public involvement plan. And for a small project, say a taxi lane rehabilitation, that could be really simple. It might be a one-page document. That document goals and outcomes, who your stakeholders are, how you're going to engage with them, and when. And for a larger project, this could be a very complex, longer involvement plan that you would develop the project. I think one key takeaway for your public involvement plan is to be flexible. I think we all have a long list of projects we've worked on over the last year that have had an incredible amount of flexibility that we've had to implement due to and changing environments as far as how we can engage with people. But even outside of pandemics. There's still times you might have a new airline, you might have a new user or a new need that pops up, something that's changed that causes you to pause and reevaluate this public involvement plan. So we're going to jump back to the Menti. So if you still have your browser window up or your cell phone, and if you don't have it, or if you're just joining, you can go to menteecom. There's the website right at the top there, and use the code 52165409. And we're just going to kind of show you a couple different question types that you can use in Menti, which again are great. This is a great tool to use with your stakeholders in meetings. But the next question is, what's one word that describes your feelings about stakeholder engagement on projects? And I think you might have a few different ways that you can type, or you might be able to type 3 questions in, or 3 words, I mean. So if we get a couple more responses here, it'll kind of populate a word cloud. And this is kind of a fun tool to use with meetings. If you have a question and people return their result with a single word answer, as you get more results, the word that stands out the most or has the most responses kind of grows in size. And it's kind of fun to see that interaction. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Melissa, who's going to give a little bit of an overview of a project that we've done and some of the different tools that we've used.
Thanks, Casey. Another question that we had on our Menti scale is, what outreach methods have you used on an airport project? So we have some examples, like a multiple choice, and you can click on whichever methods you've used in the past, such as website updates, you've done newsletters, maybe you've sent out a neighborhood notice, or what are ways that you've interacted with your stakeholders in the past. So it's great. You can see if there's multiple responses or who's done what type of outreach. So what I'm going to move towards next is an example project to share with you for the South St. Paul Airport. A little background on that project is we were tasked with doing a master plan because the existing runway was kind of at the end of its useful life. So the South St. Paul Airport has one main runway. It has over 260 based aircraft there and over 60,000 operations a year. So it's a very busy general aviation airport, no control tower. So our master plan was initiated to justify the runway length and width, and then move towards feasible alternatives to minimize impacts while this reconstruction project was happening. And then also looking at the parallel taxiway A, that was also last reconstructed, 30 years ago. It would need to be updated to meet current FAA design standards. So this master plan project was used to justify those elements in this project. What we wanted to do a little bit different with this master plan is to move more towards that empowering stakeholder engagement. So I'll go through some methods that we selected for this project. A lot of times master plans, you have surveys that are sent out, or you have an open house, but we wanted to go a little bit beyond and get more interaction in this project. So one of our first methods we used was an information kiosk. So this is a station that can be set up at the airport terminal. It can provide project information. You can also have on there ways to reach project managers or ask questions about the upcoming project. We were able to set out a survey for tenants or anybody coming through the airport to answer about the upcoming reconstruction project. So it gives you an opportunity to gather a bunch of data and also leave handouts for people as well. So they can take information about the project, absorb it, and think about it in the next coming months as you're going through the master plan project. Another benefit of this outreach method is that you can leave it up for an extended period of time. It's not just a 1-week survey and you're done, but you can leave it out for a month or whatever seems appropriate for your project. You go to the next slide. We also use polling as a technique to get stakeholder engagement in this project to be more collaborative. we had a little station set up to ask how people were hearing about this project and about the open house that we were having for this project. It's nice to be able to, determine if your advertising methods are working. So maybe this isn't even just for this one master plan project, but it could go towards any of your announcements about the airport. Are you reaching the right people? Are most people hearing about you through social media, or are they looking at newspapers or your website? It's a way to gauge how people are hearing about your projects and to make sure that you're reaching the right people at the right times, so your messages aren't going out unheard. A third method we used was to build towards empowerment in this project. That picture is an example of a calendar with the summer months over it, May through September, and it allowed people who attended an open house to document when would be a good time for them to maybe pause on their airport operations and have the runway closed, or when they're really busy and they don't want to be interrupted, if they're egg spraying or if they have corporate traffic where they're really using the runway in the month of July and they don't want to be interrupted. This allowed them to really interact with the project and have a say in when construction would be more beneficial to them or not. It allows people to, think about the project and answer anonymously, or you're also there to answer any questions they might have about the schedule. So it's nice to gain feedback before the project even happens or before a schedule is set, and allow that interaction throughout the project. Another form we used is to understand how people are using the airport. So from a project side, we're looking at the FAA criteria and the FAA requirements and recommendations, and we're trying to balance that with what stakeholders actually see happening at the airfield. So because of design requirements, we may have to close a connecting taxiway, but we want to make sure the new proposed options are suitable for pilots and that they'll use the new layout that we have. Make sure that they're happy with the results and it makes sense to them. So it's kind of a balancing act of sharing information. We can share the reason behind why something is done with the airport users, and then in reverse, the airport users can come back to us and say, yep, this works, or no, I think maybe another option would be better. So you're gaining that collaborative input as you're working on a project before final decisions are made. And then the last method I'd like to share is what we call like a red Sharpie exercise. Feedback and collaboration does not have to be formal. You can bring materials to any of your meetings, whether it be an open house or just an airport board meeting, and write on your drawings and write questions on your documents and just show that you're open to brainstorming. The project isn't final and you're looking to share ideas with everybody in attendance. That could be agencies, it could be tenants, it could be city council members, but wherever you are, just to have that Sharpie available and to be able to just draw on maps and gather ideas to show that you're listening to your stakeholders as well. So those are just kind of one project example of what was used for a master plan project. And I'm going to turn it over to Sean now, who's going to talk about stakeholder engagement from the construction side.
So stakeholder engagement, happens through all phases of the project, initial conception, planning processes, as you're getting conceptual plans years in advance, and then up through construction and post-construction. What I want to focus on is a case study at the Duluth International Airport on how we really used a lot of stakeholder engagement techniques through different phases of construction, and maybe some stories that went along with that project that really reinforced the need for that engagement and why it really determined that those methods are important to get that feedback, that conversation, that collaboration from the tenants and stakeholders and different parties that are part of the project. Some project background. Duluth International has a approximately 10,000 foot runway, runway 927, that was over 50 years old, and it needed to be reconstructed. It had a hotspot, for those that are familiar. It had a geometric configuration on the airport that caused confusion amongst pilots, and then they have an air traffic control tower. So there's just generally a layout that wasn't safe, and then they had a recognized concern to correct that geometric hotspot. The planning process, that was happened 2 years prior to this project, really laid out alternatives And we settled on a final layout, which include relocating the threshold and the runway end, relocating a taxiway connector, and then removing an inline taxiway. So you can see from this picture, it's the before condition. And for those that follow FAA design guidance and criteria, there's a few things that are causing trouble here that the FAA wanted fixed, and that really started this project. So one thing we learned early is that we have to validate the plan. That pre-construction engagement is incredibly important. And when you ask a stakeholder early on in the process, their answer might not be the same, a year later, 2 years later, or so forth. Their needs yesterday and today, vary, and as do their needs tomorrow. The story I want to share is just with a local maintenance facility that is on Duluth, and as part of the master plan process that was done by a different consulting company, they indicated that there was, that their facility and their tenants that they maintain can use the crosswind runway, and it was suitable for the type of aircraft that they were using. As we approached the project and looked at, how we were going to phase the project and allow the stakeholders to, the airlines and the maintenance, the aircraft using the maintenance facility, how they were going to use the airport, everything made sense that, the A320 could use the crosswind runway. And they indicated that in the master plan, maybe 2 or 3 years prior. What we didn't know is that they had an operational guidance change, and that their needs that they indicated previously, were no longer valid. And it took an engagement process to really bring that out, to have that discussion, to really fully find out that, every stakeholder is different, and every stakeholder has individual needs, and those needs change over time, whether it be a new person that, is leading that organization, or perhaps the airline operates a new aircraft. The conditions are always fluid, so you really have to stay up. And if you've asked them once, you might just need to ask them again. And I think that's just incredibly important to keep reinforcing that engagement, throughout the process. The pre-construction engagement, it's really important to get the word out and get to, finding out who your stakeholders are. Casey shared, that public involvement plan, identifying who's there, who needs to know information, really fully assessing who's out there and getting the notice to them so they have the opportunity to ask questions, to find out more information, so they're not surprised when there's a project happening. We, as part of this project, distributed neighbor notices. A lot of our haul roads would go past, different residential areas and businesses, and that impact is great upon them as you're, dealing with a month, summer long full of construction. For those that work through FAA designs, you know that the construction safety and phasing plan is a critical piece of the design process. Early on, the FAA wants to know that it can be done safely and according to FAA standards, and that aircraft can continue to operate if that's the way the phasing plan is written. Historically, the safety plans are submitted like this. This is an example of what the engineering drawings would look like, showing which areas are closed and which pavements are being worked on and where the safety areas are. And we realized that this isn't very inviting. It's hard to really find out what the information that, stakeholders, whether it be, airlines, tenants, anybody, who would want to know what the project is and where the impact is. So what we did is we revised it to something that looks like this, which is a little bit more appealing. It makes you really want to look at it to find out more exactly what the project is and where it is happening on the airfield. So basically, walking through this figure, this safety plan is used, purely for stakeholder engagement. We want to get a document that's easy to understand and that shows where the impacts will be and when they're going to happen. The blue box is phase information. Quickly, just what is the project? What are we doing during this phase of the project? What are we trying to accomplish? The orange box is closures. What pavement is closed? Does the FBO, can they What pavements are they allowed to use? Can they share that information with the flight school on where they can taxi and what they can do? Equally important is what's available. So we really wanted to share, that there is a runway that's still available and it's going to be displaced or it's going to be shortened, but there is a runway that will still maintain operations for some aircraft. Instrument approach procedures affects many users at an airfield as you're embarking on a large construction project, specifically on their main runway. So we wanted to highlight exactly what the FAA determination is for the construction. A lot of the instrument approach procedures, are not available or they have reduced minimums. We want to clearly say that this is what the impact you'll see during the project. And finally, the duration. When is it going to happen? How long is it going to happen? What are, can I relocate to another airfield? Can I do other things that help stakeholders really assess where they're at? One key component to this is the airfield firefighting and rescue vehicles. They need to be able to maintain their access to maintain the life safety of the airport. This document was critical for them to figure out where they can go, how they're going to get there, and how they would respond. And another key component is the FBO had different needs than the airlines. The FBO was very concerned about how much runway was available, so the declared distance in the sheet was critically important to them. Whereas the 148th, the fighter wing that flies F-16s at Duluth, they just wanted to know how to get to their base. How are they going to taxi through this area and be able to get in and out of their facility? Another approach that we took was tenant meetings in project meetings, project updates. So what we wanted to do is find, to engage the right people at the right time. We wanted to find out where they're at and approach them. Presenting at tenant meetings isn't quite enough, however, because we realize that there, at a tenant meeting, there's, the car rental company, there's, TSA, a lot of people that really weren't affected by the project. And oftentimes the one group that you did want to speak with, potentially the decision makers for the FBO or the airlines, they weren't there, so they didn't hear the message. So what I really propose is that you get creative in a virtual world. We've learned over these last few months to a year that the virtual environment actually has given us a lot of opportunity to find people where they are and get them to join meetings in different capacities. So one thing we did is really to start looking for those opportunities. How can we find the people? And the guidance from our sponsor was basically saying, provide the opportunity for them to hear about this project until they're tired of hearing from us, to really just keep it out there. And, when they say, yep, I've heard that, I'm good, then we've done our job. This picture here is a good example of that. That's actually at an EEA barbecue. And, it's kind of the whole key of, going to where the pilots are. And for those that are pilots, we found them in their natural habitat. We found them in a hangar with free food. So it was like perfect. They had hot dogs and they, then we could get their attention and say, this is the project, this is the board, this is what you can expect next month. We developed working groups. What we found is, we really need to move from this informing, pushing this information onto the tenants and the stakeholders and the people using the airfield to an empowerment. They didn't feel, a lot of the stakeholders didn't feel like they were part of the process and, that the way they use the airfield wasn't being listened to. So what we did is we developed 5 working groups throughout the design process to focus on key areas for each meeting and, solicit their questions and develop a request for information log and respond to them and make sure that they were heard. And then we actually changed our plan many times in order to account for this. And that happened in order to really just make sure that you all know it's an impactful project, that the runway might be closed for a day or it's going to be shortened in a shortened condition. But we want to find that least impactful alternative in order to allow the construction to go as smoothly as possible. And at the end of the day, the stakeholders are getting a brand new runway out of the deal and really just making sure that that's important. And I mentioned there was five working group meetings. The first one happened well before design, so those changes could be really made into the design. So we're not telling them this is what we did. We're saying, what do you think, and how can we do it better? And we build that into the project. Use technology. So this is a changing field, and it's happening rapidly, and the tools are amazing. So I really encourage, however innovative you want to be, is to find ways to take that innovation and put it into your projects. We use drone technology on a lot of our projects, not only for stakeholder engagement, but for contractor coordination, for surveys, visualizations. You can see the right, that's actually at a different airport, but it really shows that, as we're relocating a runway, what's it going to look like? And that gives a lot of clarity to people that, maybe are a little bit uneasy about future development. One thing we were able to do with the drone technology is create panoramic views in panoramic photography. Casey's going to show basically what this is, a panoramic video picture. So you can actually scroll around 360 degrees, and you can look at, the construction progress in the distance. You can look at the batch plant operation. So the contractor actually used this information more than we did, because the contractor was really excited just to find out how their layout was, where they could expand to, how they could best utilize their site. And then just looking at the airfield as a whole, and different tenants were able to really see how they fit in this construction project and how it was going to be a better project at the end of it. And that, just getting excited about it, just shares a level of excitement with the project. And technology, as I mentioned before, we've gone virtual. We understand it. I think people are getting more and more comfortable with it. There's still some reservations out there, but you're going to be able to grab an audience that you weren't able to do before. Before, you had to have that person come to the meeting, and then you could share information. But now you can have a meeting, and people could call in, and you can share that information almost instantaneously. Construction newsletters. This is also another approach that we took, is that people were just interested to find out exactly what was happening, and if it was on schedule or different things that were going on. They would notice that it would rain for 2 weeks straight, and they're like, are you going to be able to finish this project? And the answer was no. I mean, there was a weather delay that you obviously can't control. But these construction newsletters were an opportunity to share that information. So give you consistent messaging. Every Friday, we sent a newsletter at the same time, so people expected it. And if they chose to read it, they were able to read it. And that was another thing that we really found important. There's some automated emailing and tracking programs out there, MailChimp, Constant Contact, a few others. You put your distribution list in there, everything's automated. You send out your message, but you also know who read the email. So, if somebody's complaining that, hey, you're not giving me any updates, you're going to say, well, did you get the email that we sent last Friday? And you can see that they actually never read it, or they deleted it, or maybe they're not getting it. It went to their automatically their junk folder, and, they're not getting the message. And now that you can have another conversation in a different way. It also equalizes the sharing of information. There's information for everybody, and it kind of, really just levels the playing field. There's some more examples. We also did them in PDF format that were emailed to a tenant list. So just a great information technique. Stakeholders aren't the only ones. Sometimes just the general public are important to share your message. And again, it's finding out, where the public is going to interact with your project. Project boards, this is at a similar project in Duluth, but, we put it right where there was a trail that a lot of the neighbors would walk by, and they wanted to know what was going on the airport, and they wanted to know what project was and why it would be doing. And we actually shared a lot of benefits of the project, and that really built that engagement from the local tenants in the area. One really important part is, okay, you're done with your project. Now you have to message the change post-construction. And we created this board to share what exactly the project was and how things are different now. And the different groups were able to share this with, the flight schools able to share it with their pilots. The airlines were able to share it, with their pilots. The 148th Fighter Wing, had it as one of their, one of their NOTAMs that they shared with all their pilots and ops crew. The Duluth Airport Authority, their ground crew used it to really understand exactly what the project was and what had changed. So this was just a great document that was put up on the FBO room and different flight rooms for people to understand, okay, this is the condition, these are the new runway lengths, these are the taxiway connector names. Everybody gets a better understanding of what the project was and how it is looking going forward.
Great, thanks, Sean. Next, I want to pause, and Sean and Melissa talked a lot about stakeholder engagement with tenants and airport users and your neighbors, but I want to talk about a different project and another really important piece to remember with stakeholder engagement, and that is making sure that you're engaging with your agency partners in the right way. And I'm going to talk about the Falls International Airport in International Falls, Minnesota. You can see a kind of small aerial photo there on the screen. Single commercial service runway. It has a small crosswind runway for really small kind of A1, B1 single engine aircraft. They do have air carrier service, and their runway was also in need of reconstruction. And we knew that this project was going to be incredibly impactful to the airport. Likely, most likely, I think the airport went in really thinking they were going to lose commercial service for, at least one summer. And this community is really dependent on commercial service for the tourism industry, both locally in the community as well as across the border in Canada. So what International Falls did was they paused before moving into design of this project to do what they called a triggering event master plan, really a planning study that was focused on the phasing needs and looking at this runway project. It was kind of more of actually a collaborative project between planning and engineering to first assess the current condition of the runway, and then from there develop a phasing strategy to minimize impacts specifically to commercial service operations. And we also wanted to develop a funding strategy and work with the FAA and the state and other funding sources that were available to the airport to make sure that before they even entered into design, there was an agreed upon funding plan for the project. And critically is doing that key stakeholder engagement with all different types of stakeholders on the airport. So with this project, I want to take a moment just to talk about who else you need to make sure that you're bringing along through your project. And in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit specifically about the FAA and the state. It's really important not to forget your agency partners as you're messaging your project, whether it be a project that's just an idea in your head and you're thinking maybe in a couple of years, or if it's a project you're going to do this year, or a project you're maybe in the middle of, or a project that you're closing out. That engagement and how you're working with your agency partners is just as important as how you work with tenants and users on your airport. I think, one great piece of advice is just making sure that you're telling your story and you're telling it very well. What are all the details that people need to know, specifically with the FAA? What do they need to know to be able to build support for your project? What's your project need? Has it changed over time? Is the story different today than it was before? And making sure that you're providing all of the justification and documentation in a very succinct and concise, easy to understand way. Also making sure that, as you're thinking of potential challenges, that you're coming forward again with that really concise message of, hey, these are the challenges we think we're going to encounter, and here's what our proposed solutions are to deal with those challenges. So, I think the other piece to remember, just as, you might have two different stakeholders on your airport, say a local flying club and an airline, and they're going to have very different needs and want to see information in different ways. And the same is true for the FAA. Different lines of business within the FAA all have different roles, and they come at things with a different lens. And I think that's really important to remember as you're developing materials and information that you want to share, and when you're thinking of the information you want to get back from them. It's really important that they have a clear understanding of your project in a really succinct manner, and that your needs, and helping them have that clear understanding really helps them provide meaningful feedback. And I think it's really important, especially once you start looking beyond the ADO, thinking of tech ops or flight procedures. They look at tons of airports, and it's really important that you always have that clear picture of your project. What problem are you trying to solve? What's the phasing of your project in a really easy to understand method or way. So in the case of International Falls, we were proposing a temporary runway on the taxiway, and we knew that this had a long list of challenges that needed to be overcome in order to make this a feasible phase for this project. We'd been working very collaboratively with the ADO for several months as part of this planning project, and we needed to sit down with more senior leadership within the FAA from the region and really talk through what we were proposing to and what were the challenges and what were some proposed solutions. The ADO had been knee deep in this project for several, knew all the details about it, but it was important to understand that the region came at it with really not a lot of background. So we needed to quickly get them up to speed and be ready to dive into a conversation and provide meaningful feedback. So kind of similar to the construction safety phasing plans that Sean shared, we did create, we called it, an issues map or a challenges map. And we put all of the different things that we wanted to talk about into different buckets so that we could have very focused conversations about different issues. So we had identified things that were standards issues that we needed to resolve or agree upon ways to mitigate. We had environmental issues that needed to be discussed, as well as infrastructure improvements that would need to be made, and other issues that maybe didn't necessarily need to get documented on a map or couldn't, but were really critically important, schedule or political challenges with the project. And this graphic was incredibly helpful in helping everybody quickly get up to speed and dive right into a really meaningful conversation that really helped drive this project forward. As kind of a corresponding tool that we did to that graphic was to identify and really be more forward thinking on what some of the challenges and key decision points that we needed to agree upon along the way. We didn't know if this temporary runway was going to be a feasible alternative. There was an incredibly long list of challenges. What we needed to do is kind of make sure everybody could stay focused on what were the things we needed to agree upon or concurrence points we had. In this first column here, we had 4 main things that we needed to essentially get to yes on. And once we got to yes on all of those 4 things, then we had another 4 things, and we needed to get to yes on each of those things. If at any time we couldn't get to yes on one of these items, we knew that this alternative of a temporary runway wasn't going to work. But this was really, really helpful in our conversations with our agency partners in helping build support for the project and really showing that the sponsor was working through the project evaluation in a really thoughtful way. Another benefit that, we were thinking of, along the way is that it was very likely that this wasn't going to be feasible. And if in the end it was determined it wasn't feasible, it's a great tool for the airport sponsor to have to document for stakeholders everything that they did to get to where they were if they were going to have to close the runway. So it was a great tool just from a documentation standpoint as well. So we did create kind of a similar construction safety phasing plan drawing for this project as in the Duluth project. And I'm going to talk about it more from the lens of the FAA. So, we used it for stakeholders for sure in the very similar way that we did in Duluth, but specific to INL or International Falls, it was incredibly helpful, specific to engagement with the FAA. Our use of this tool really began as part of tools that we were creating for a very complex safety risk management panel we did as part of this project. We were getting together all of these different stakeholders from different areas of the airport world. We had airlines, we had different lines of business within the FAA, the cert inspector, flight procedures. We had a local pilot, we had the mayor, we had all of these different people with different levels of understanding of the project and the phasing and the airports in general. And so we really needed everybody to have a shared understanding of the phasing in order for us to make sure that we were having very meaningful engagement and feedback as part of this SRM panel. So that's really how this all began. However, it grew in use through that process and has been incredibly helpful for, like Sean said, airline coordination, tenant coordination. But really where we found a lot of value in it is with the different FAA lines of business. One of the staff from flight procedures, actually, we kind of laugh because we've given her other, more traditional construction safety phasing plan drawings and other things. And she's like, I'm not even looking at those anymore. I just want to look at this drawing because it's so much easier for her to quickly understand the phasing and what it is that we're proposing. These drawings have also been incredibly helpful for some temporary modifications to standards that we've needed to request from the FAA. Again, really just using it as a tool to share all of the details so that everybody can answer all of their questions in order to provide whatever feedback it is you're looking for from them. So we're going to jump back to the Menti if you have your browser up or your phone. And again, you can take a picture of the QR code there or type the code in. And I'm going to switch screens and you'll see it again. So the next question is just to kind of, is there any new method that you maybe haven't tried that you're interested in trying? Whether it's just, something you maybe heard about today or something you've been thinking of, over time, or you've seen in other airports or other cases where things have been done. So if you want to type in your answer, I guess select your answer, and I think you should be able to click more than one. And we just wanted to highlight this Menti as a tool. There's some really great question formats that you can use. We've used it recently on a planning study where you're presenting alternatives and you can ask people to provide feedback kind of on a scale where you can do a little slider across the screen. There's maybe 10 or 15 different question types that you can use. So it's a really great tool for projects to get feedback in meetings from stakeholders, especially virtual meetings, but even in-person meetings. It's a really, really great tool. And I know we've gotten a lot of really great feedback from stakeholders from the ability to use Menti as part of their project meetings. So with that, we just want to leave you with maybe a challenge to think about, what you can do differently on future projects or at your airport or in other parts of your life as it relates to stakeholder engagement. Hopefully there's some tool or technique or an idea or concept that you've heard today that is interesting or that you might want to try. So we just encourage you to think about that in your future projects. And with that, we'll pause and see if there's any questions that anybody has.
I do not have any questions at this time.
Great. Well, Melissa or Sean, do you have anything you'd like to add before we wrap up?
The only thing I may add is that, we shared some examples, and I think flexibility is really important, and adaptiveness and innovation. You really, it starts with that public involvement plan at the very beginning and kind of assessing where you're at, who your stakeholders are, what problem you're trying to solve, and really just digging in and asking questions on how you can deliver that message, not only to inform, because everybody wants to know. I think that's a certain level, but your better project is going to come, from getting that feedback, having dialogue, collaborating, and having people own a part of the project. I think that's really where the benefit comes from, all of these tools, is to really just start having conversations and getting to know, where people are coming from and what their true need is. Because sometimes they'll say a need, but it's not really, you're not really fully comprehending or understanding what a stakeholder, a business, an airline might really be concerned about. And then just fully understand there's going to be conflicting views. Everybody's going to have a different opinion, and that's okay. You're trying to find, where that common ground is and how you can build a better project with all of that feedback together to make it as least impactful as possible and to have people own the result.
Great. Well, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today on stakeholder engagement, and hopefully you'll find something useful that you can implement at your airport.